With the four major divisions of this passage in mind, we may now look more closely at Genesis chapter 2 through 3 to see the dramatic symmetry that this passage displays. By juxtaposing different elements in these sections, Moses revealed the central concerns of his narrative. To explore the symmetries of this narrative, we'll look first at the balance which exists between the beginning and ending of our narrative, and then we'll take a look at the symmetry between the two middle portions of the story. Let's look first at the beginning and ending of this passage. As we will see, Genesis chapter 2 verses 4 through 17 and 3, 22 through 24 stand in sharp contrast with each other in at least three important ways. The first contrast is in location. The account begins in chapter 2 verse 7 with God placing Adam within the paradise garden. Adam lived and worked in a place full of divine blessings. Wonderful vegetation, life-giving water, precious metals and stones surrounded him on every side. But by contrast, the narrative ends in chapter 3 verse 24 with God expelling Adam and Eve from the garden. This geographical contrast makes it clear that the most desirable place for human beings to be on earth was in the Garden of Eden. A second difference in the focus in each section is on the special trees of the garden. Although chapter 2 verses 4 through 17 mentions two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, by the time we come to chapter 2 verse 17, attention moves just to the one tree, the tree of knowledge. This tree held the power to give human beings the experiential knowledge of goodness and sin. It could open their eyes to see things that they had not seen before. By contrast, at the end of the narrative, in chapter 3 verses 22 through 24, God was no longer concerned with the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but exclusively with the tree of life. This tree had the power to give human beings eternal life, but God banished Adam and denied access to this tree. This contrast made it clear that free access which humanity once had to the garden and all of the blessings that were there had been lost until God decreed otherwise. A third difference between the beginning and ending of our narrative is in humanity's commission. In chapter 2 verse 15, the first step reports that God commissioned Adam to blessed work in the garden with no pain and no difficulty. In chapter 3 verse 23, however, God banished Adam and Eve from the garden and condemned them to difficult toil outside of the garden. This contrast also provides an essential perspective on the story. Not only did humanity lose the wonder of life in Eden, we were also condemned to difficulty so long as we remained away from the garden. These three contrasts between the opening and closing sections of Genesis chapters 2 and 3 draw our attention to some of the most vital aspects of this narrative. Moses wrote about a major shift in the human condition that took place in primeval times. God originally ordained that human beings should dwell in his garden, but Adam and Eve's sin bound them to difficulty and trouble and separated them from the tree that gives eternal life. Now, as we will see, this set of contrasts spoke directly to the situation in which the Israelites found themselves as Moses led them toward the Promised Land. The Israelites had been far from Eden as they suffered under the cruelty of slavery in Egypt. They needed to regain the blessings which God provided in Eden. With the contrasting symmetries of the outer portions of the story in mind, we should turn our attention to the middle portions of the story, chapter 2 verses 18 through 25 and chapter 3 verses 1 through 21. These two inner steps fill in the gap between the beginning and the ending, and they form their own set of contrasting symmetries in at least three ways. One contrast focuses on humanity's relationship with God. In the second step, we see a harmonious relationship between Adam and God. In chapter 2, verse 18, God expressed concern for Adam and brought Adam a perfect partner in Eve. The picture here is that of God and the human race in intimacy and at peace. Yet, in the third portion of the narrative, disharmony replaces the initial harmony between God and the human race. Adam and Eve disobeyed God's command, and in chapter 3, verse 8, they hid from God's approach, and God spoke angrily against Adam and Eve. A second contrast exists in human relationships. In the second step of chapter 2, verses 18 through 25, Adam and Eve were in perfect bliss. In chapter 2:23, Adam broke forth with the first love poem in the Bible, saying that Eve was bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and they lived together naked and without shame. By contrast, however, in chapter 3, verse 16, God pronounced a curse on this relationship, declaring that strife would persist between the man and the woman. The woman would desire her husband, and he would rule over her. These words revealed that the sin of Adam and Eve not only disrupted their relationship with God, but with each other as well. And from that point forward, human relationships have been characterized by difficulty and struggle. A third contrast appears in humanity's relationship with evil. In the second step, evil is absent from the story. Adam and Eve were entirely innocent and separated from the power of evil. But by the third section, humanity had fallen prey to the serpent and was locked into a long-term struggle with evil. In chapter 3, verse 15, God promised that Eve's seed would one day overcome the serpent, but no immediate victory was offered to Adam and Eve. These contrasts between the second and third portions of the narrative help us see a number of concerns which Moses had as he wrote this narrative. Moses wrote about Adam and Eve in ways that connected to Israel's experience. Sin continued to wreak havoc in Israel's life. It damaged the people's relationship with God and with each other. And more than this, every day of hardship they endured reminded Moses and Israel that just like Adam and Eve, they had to wait for the time when God would finally give victory over evil to his people.